morning show. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the next section we're going into, which is the Game Master Vacuum. Those of you that play role-play games and have for a long time realize that a good game master is difficult to find because, quite frankly, there aren't a lot of good mechanisms for teaching the ways to do this portion of the job, so to speak. And there's also a much larger group of people that would want to play than to actually be the storyteller or administrator. So with that, I wanted to mention the fact that the game mastery vacuum is expanding, in that for a long time, the mechanisms for being a storyteller and game master were integral to the game. In other words, when role-play games started back in the 1970s, and I started when it actually, arguably either just before or right after it launched in 74, 75 window, the mechanism for play was such that the game master's rules were included in the same volume as the player's information. And therefore, everybody that had access to the rule book, so to speak, had access to everything that they would need to be a storyteller. Now, over time, that has dwindled somewhat because, as products will do, they bifurcated the material for the storyteller away from the material for the players. And there were reasons for that. One of the principal reasons for separating the player information from the game master information is that there is a nuance of surprise and excitement that occurs when something's happening and you as a player don't have perfect knowledge. You don't have awareness of everything. Therefore, unless a player takes the effort to actually consume the game mastery information, it's often difficult to capture the pieces and the elements that would make it possible to adjudicate in the game. This led, therefore, early on into the quick and dirty distinction between the game master and the players. And that line became more intense as time went by because there were more people that were coming into tabletop role-play games that were coming from a video games marketplace, and therefore they didn't have access to the, if you will, the backside of what the information that a game master needs. And so therefore, even if they had a penchant for being a storyteller, they couldn't rapidly gather that information because it wasn't directly available in the frame of work that they were actually participating in. And give me just 1 second here. I'm do one other thing. Pardon me. Quick. Alrighty. So you just want to get back to this and make sure you're in the right place. Yes, we are. Alrighty. So therefore, the games mastery window shrank. There were fewer people who were game masters, and there was also a mechanism that was developed in computer video games, and I distinguish between them often when I'm conversing, and some people find that need to separate them unnerving or even adversarial. But the tabletop environment requires the social interaction and communication skills that may not be available on the top line, if you will. And so therefore, the players that came into the marketplace, the players who actually chose to pick up the dice, step behind the shield, and became storytellers, were at a handicap, which meant that the new game masters coming on were players first, and players much more directly than they were game masters, and therefore the idea of moving into the environment was confusing to them and difficult to pick up, and therefore they would come into it with the same mental tropes from the games that they already played in, and then would utilize those in their own development of a story going forward. Now, those persons who came at it from that angle, therefore, would create a story frame that later the terminology became known as railroading, because the initial computer offerings, video game offerings, were themselves linear in nature, because the person creating them had an idea in his mind for how the story should go, and with the limitations that computer commands would provide, it made it difficult for them to convey options that would let players make other choices. Ironically, that is one of the things that makes being a role player in a video marketplace somewhat inhibited compared to being a role player in a tabletop environment, because you get to know what your limitations are. As a matter of fact, you learn, which, if you're talking about a video game that's got a video component where you're actually moving the figure in the game, then, which of course later became known as the tune of the game. I'm going to talk about that in a later session. But the idea is that the tune, or the character that was moving on the screen, only had certain actions it was allowed to. One of the glaring examples I can think of was even in the 2000 era video games like Metal Gear Solid or things like this. Your character, in order to get through certain locations, would have to crouch. Now, perhaps another more resourceful person might say, why don't I just go around this object, or why don't I climb over it, or whatever. There wasn't a mechanism to do that. You had to follow the extreme limitations of the character in the game, and therefore you had to crouch to pass through. And that mechanistic limitation led to people in tabletop games feeling likewise that they would be restricted or constricted in their actions. And game masters fomented this by actually holding players to those limitations. This therefore leads to a reason for the game master's vacuum to increase further, because players who are now playing in a role-play game that was being run by somebody who had come from that kind of an environment, then they would put limitations on the players as well. And this led, therefore, to a poor experience. Either they felt railroaded or guided in their direction so that they felt like they didn't have any player agency, or conversely, because they were so now free in a classic tabletop role-play experience to be able to do anything, they felt thwarted when they played the video games as well, because in those cases they would therefore feel the angst of not being able to do things that a person could do in real life that you can't do in the video game. This is the reason why even until the last decade or so, the video game RPG experience was lackluster. Now, with the advancements that we're seeing with AI and faster processing and better video quality and better skin control of the wireframes or whatever, all of a sudden you've got more opportunities and more actions, and therefore games today are arguably considerably better than the old ones, but they're still falling short. Now, the reason why I also say the game mastery vacuum is expanding is that, yes, we've already got a limitation on the number of players. We've got a limitation on the number of game masters that are out there. Then you add video experiences like Critical Role or other online role-play mechanisms that allow you to experience role-play, but they then showed a different side of role-play that the rank and file, I guess you'd call it, the standard role-play game master had difficulty with. So, for example, there was multifaceted personalities. The game master's explanation style, the narrative style, wasn't as dynamic, and so by having to compare ourselves with professional voice actors and professional performers in a live session causes the game master to feel confused and less valuable, because they perceive perhaps they don't have the skill set, and therefore it becomes more and more specialized. Add to that the advent of professional game masters. Now, in the case of professional games mastery, that is a difficult nut to crack, because games are, we think of other forms of entertainment, and many of them are free. You can go out and play catch with your kids, or you can go out and throw a frisbee around or whatever, and those things don't have any additional cost other than the frisbee and any possible injury that might occur in the process. But the idea here is that the idea of paying a storyteller, a game master, makes the experience feel less game-like and more entertainment-like, and the quality of the output, especially in those more professional presentations here on Twitch or in other venues, does seem to lend itself to saying that a game master has to improve his skills. But the irony there is that therefore it raises the bar for a new game master, even one that comes from a play background, to move into the marketplace becomes more difficult, more challenging, and therefore they think they can't perform. Now add to that this newest nuance of licensing of role-play mechanisms, the ability to use the game tools to achieve what they were attempting to do in performance. And now you've continued to reduce the number of game masters that are willing to take that risk and to provide product. Now, the benefit of having a professional game master is obviously in order to put a dollar value on their performance, they have to have some level of expertise in that to draw that. And therefore, new game masters coming on who are entering from the idea of I want to be a free game master, or they even want to think about entering the pro game mastery world. Now they've got a challenge because they have to have a much larger skill set. Now, the irony also is that the wider field of games mastery is beyond just the fantasy settings, and this is something that most game masters don't pursue. And therefore, when you say, I want to play a role-play game, but I want to play it in a science fiction setting, or I want to play it in a post-apocalyptic setting, or whatever, these new changes, these new processes, there's not really a mechanism for doing that, and therefore games masters feel thwarted because they're familiar with the games that they've played, but they're not ready to expand, and therefore there are fewer game masters that are full function and can do all those different things. So that these things have led to a reduction in games masters overall.